Good morning. The first reading is from Acts, Book 7, verses 23 to 36, and continues the story of Moses. When he was 40 years old, it came into Moses' heart to visit his relatives, the Israelites. When he saw one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his kinfolk would understand that God through him was rescuing them, but they did not understand. The next day he came to some of them as they were quarreling and tried to reconcile them, saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong each other?" But the man who was wronging his neighbor pushed Moses aside, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When he heard this, Moses fled and became a resident, alien, in the land of Midian. There he became the father of 2 sons. Now, when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai, in the flame of a burning bush. When Moses saw it, he was amazed at the sight. And as he approached to look, there came the voice of the Lord. "I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses began to tremble and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have surely seen the mistreatment of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their groaning, and I have come down to rescue them. Come now, I will send you to Egypt." It was this Moses whom they rejected when they said, "Who made you a ruler and a judge?" And whom God now sent as both ruler and liberator through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out, having performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. The word of the Lord.
Thanks, Nancy. So I want to thank you for having me here this morning before the next reading. It's always a delight to be back with this congregation, and I look forward to it each year. So thank you very much. The passage I'm going to read now from the Gospel of Luke, from chapter 10, is probably one of the passages that in my life I've struggled with more than almost any other passage. And so I'm sharing it this morning, saying that at the beginning. It's a passage that bothers me in a lot of ways. It's a passage that has a lot that I need to learn in it, that I haven't quite made peace with even at this point in my life. So here we go. Luke chapter 10, beginning with verse 38. Now, as the disciples went on their way, Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, so she came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." This is the word of the Lord. So most years, if you know me at all, you know that I make it through the month of May by knowing I'm moving towards summer, a period of time I always look forward to. Things that a lot of the churches in our Presbyterian May are in their final push of one church year and the planning stages of another church year, bringing with that push a slew of questions and issues for me to deal with at exactly the same time that my college courses that I'm teaching are all coming to an end, and my students are turning in piles of term papers, and there are final exams to correct and courses to grade as the semester ends. But to keep me going through May and my workload then, I begin to think about mid-June and summer, when all the work will be behind me and there'll be lots of time to play flute and guitar, to weave, to swim, to do stained glass projects, all the things that I've been pushing off all during the academic year. I'll be able to read the pile of books that are by my bed, books that have absolutely nothing to do with the courses I'm teaching or religion or churches, nothing to do with any of those, but just waiting for me, that are piling up little by little beginning September, right? And I'll work in my garden, I'll can, I'll dehydrate some of what grows. It'll be a wonderful June, July, and August. But then, as June arrives and I turn in my final course grades, someone always offers me an interesting summer project of one kind or another. And the Presbytery decides to use the lull in demands from churches to catch up on rewrites of manuals. This year, both the Committee on Ministry manual and the manual for a proposed property committee. And I find myself once again busy and needing to multitask my way through the summer. This past month, as I found myself getting busier and busier, I also noticed that in both casual conversations with my friends and overheard conversations between folks I didn't know, busyness seemed to be the theme of the day. In fact, it seems to be the new standard response to, "How are you?" "I'm busy." "I'm so busy. You won't believe how busy I am. I had to bring a pile of work home with me again this weekend. I'm much busier now that I'm retired than I was when I was working. I'm so busy that I have no real weekend. I've got to use Saturday and Sunday to run to the hardware store, the supermarket, the mall, and then, by the time I add my kids' activities and play dates, there's just no weekend left. It's shot." It began to puzzle me. Have we all fallen into the white rabbit syndrome, where we rush through life muttering a busy variation of the I'm late for a very important date, no time to say hello, goodbye, I'm late. What is this busyness deal? Are we working so much more? Well, nope, we're not. The average work week these days is, anyone want to take a guess? 33 hours. A clear decline since the 1960s. The time spent on unpaid work, stuff like housework, childcare, has also declined. So why don't we feel it? I had no idea. But then I discovered a chapter of a book called Everyday Theology that I wasn't supposed to be reading because it was summer, and it's religion, but it was there, and it sounded like a good title, and it was going along with the project I had. So in it, Charles Anderson explains the following. Busyness today seems widespread. It goes beyond a seasonal occurrence and has become for many the default rhythm of life. Why is that? At least 3 factors help explain our state. The condition of overchoice, the blurring of boundaries in our lives, largely through technology, and the influence of work on our psychological understanding of time. Those 3 things. Overchoice is a phrase first created by Alvin Toffler to reflect the stress we feel from having more options than we can handle. To understand it, all you have to do is think of the supermarket, where overchoice can eat up huge amounts of time as you calculate which of the 3 or 4 brands of local, organic, free-range eggs really is both the healthiest and the most environmentally responsible to buy. Overchoice gives us more things than we could possibly ever do that all of us still want to do and try to do, right? So overchoice. The blurring of boundaries, Anderson says, is the second reason for our feeling so busy. Last year, for example, 22% of us did work from home as well as while we were at the office. a number that has increased consistency since it was first measured in 2003. Our phones, our tablets, our laptops are allowing us to keep both home and work with us wherever we go so that we're constantly on. The third factor Anderson lists, the one that interests me the most this morning, is the relationship between work and psychological time, where because of technology, work becomes more and more detached from natural rhythms. More than 63% of Americans now work outside the traditional 9-to-5, Monday through Friday schedule. Our work hours haven't increased, but their distribution has changed, and so time feels different. These days, given the easy access to such technology, we can now set up a network of Skype calls and Zoom meetings in such a way, for example, that people in Korea, Malawi, and New York can all be in a business meeting together with no attention paid to the time zones that the attendees are living in. Time differences fade as we've moved to a 24/7 economic world, and there's virtually no psychological downtime anymore. We might begin to ask ourselves the question that the Grateful Dead songwriter John Perry Barlow asked: how thin can I spread myself before I'm no longer there? As I read Anderson and his analysis of why we feel busy these days, I began to think about what the Bible has to say about busyness. The first story that popped into my head was today's gospel story of Jesus coming over to his friends Mary and Martha's home for dinner. Martha, strung out by all the work around offering a wonderful meal and a hospitable home, asked Jesus to take her sister Mary, who's sitting chatting with the guests, to task. Jesus, in response, tells Martha that Mary has made the better choice. Well, that's easy for him to say now that the meal is already made and before him. But then I remembered the psalmist, who in Psalm 127 chides, "In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat. For God grants sleep to those God loves." Time, the Bible says, is a gift, with God, not people, as the ruler of time. And busyness oriented toward economic gain at the cost of human life should be called today what the Bible calls it: foolish greed, which the psalmist sees as a short step away from idolatry, since it means we're trusting in ourselves, not in God. But the Bible also speaks again and again of our responsibility to redeem time. There are times when busyness is a virtue, not a vice, if it is a busyness grounded in and growing out of our ongoing relationships with God, with other people, and with creation. Holy busyness carries with it a sense of the priorities of relationships, not goals, with the destination not a place or an achievement, but a person. God, it turns out, isn't first and foremost interested in our getting somewhere. God is just interested in being in relationship with us. And then there's the story of Moses. When I ask about Moses in my college courses, what most of my students know about him is from the Disney cartoon, Prince of Egypt. How many of you have seen that at some point? Prince of Egypt. 1, 2, okay. Well, it does a wonderful job of capturing some of the story of Moses, but it misses two of my favorite parts of the tale. The book of Acts, however, in its retelling of the Moses story, doesn't miss either part. It tells us that after Moses hot-foots it out of Egypt to Midian, he settles as a stranger, and he makes a living keeping sheep. So far, that's all in the Disney version, all right? But in the Disney account, the bush goes up in flames about 3 minutes after Moses has been in Midian. 3 minutes. In Acts, we're told 40 years had passed between the time Moses arrived in Midian and the time God decides to appear to him at Sinai. 40 years, during which time Moses gets married, has and raises 2 children, but also learns how to sit and wait, cultivating patience, studying silence, without which he probably would have rushed busily by God's burning bush on his way to his next task. And a little later in Moses' life, though again the Disney film misses it, the people of Israel learn the same lesson in their expedition out of Egypt in the direction of the Promised Land. That trip from Egypt to Israel probably could have been made in 40 days if the people had traveled in a straight line from point of origin to point of destination. But God and Moses did great work together, causing the people to spend how long in the desert? 40 years, right? They meandered slowly around in circles for 40 years. Great job, Moses. Great job, God. During that time, the people had to let go of their breathless busyness they'd come to expect in Egypt, and they had to instead begin to spend some quality time, both in relationship with each other and with God. They learned to trust in something other than their own achievements during those 40 years, as on a daily basis God provided manna that was so perishable it could only last for one day. If they tried to keep it overnight, it spoiled. They had to trust that on the next day, God would provide manna again. They couldn't make it happen, no matter how hard they worked or how busy they became. They just had to meander around, collecting manna as it randomly fell from the sky, and during the time when manna wasn't falling, they had to rest in the shade. No other options. It's hard for us today to see meandering and rest as holiness, not laziness. These days, I think no activity is more universally panned than napping. We equate sleeping with goofing off. After all, when you're asleep, you can't answer emails, you can't text, you can't participate in a web conference. But the Bible, from the Torah through the psalmist into the early church, suggests that it's through cycles of slowness and rest interspersed with our activity that our lives remain sane, safe, and perhaps even holy. Eugene Peterson reminds us that Sabbath is to be the, quote, uncluttered time and space to distance ourselves from the frenzy of our own activities so we can see what God has been doing and is doing. The faster the tracks, the more we need to learn the art of slowing down and going slow, of doing what the Bible calls Sabbath keeping. Instead of letting the busyness of the week frame our time, we should let times of Sabbath frame our week. Doing so would be countercultural, counter both to the world and often to the church. It would mean overcoming our fear that if we stopped working for a while, someone else would keep working and get ahead of us, by trusting that God gives us sufficient time to do what we need to do and takes care of what we can't get done. Jesus is a perfect example of how to insert Sabbaths into crushing, chaotic schedules. If Jesus could do it, so can we. Jesus spent his public ministry with crowds pressing him and hounding him, keeping him up late, waking him up early, but Jesus knew when it was time to declare a Sabbath break, be it for a moment, an hour, a day, or more. In one gospel story after another, when he's busy and behind, Jesus doesn't promise himself a vacation when things slow down, or start elaborate planning for distant times of getaways. When he's hemmed in by demands that are making him too busy, he abruptly declares a downtime, an on-the-spot sabbatical. Read the text. It's just suddenly, I'm taking a break. is basically what he says. He goes off alone, or he gets in a boat and he crosses to the other side, or he goes, like today, to hang out with friends, or he finds a quiet place to take a nap, or to watch the sunset. Jesus reminds us that Sabbath is not so much about taking a break as it is about changing frequencies, allowing ourselves the time to take a deep breath before we plunge into a new duty or a new responsibility. We could declare Sabbath time in many different ways: standing in our garden and breathing in the scents of the flowers, taking a break from electronic media of all kinds, sharing the pleasure of good food with a few people we love, going out for an evening stroll, or in the old-fashioned way of early 20th century life, spending time on the front porch. The street I live in Dobbs Ferry, Maple Street, is a collection of what could at best be called an eclectic gathering of styles of homes. We have Victorian, colonial, saltbox, multifamily, single family, pleasing to the eye and downright ugly, all on our street. And most of the houses are at least 100 years old. Because of that, the one thing that almost all the houses, unless they've had major renovations added to them recently, have are front porches of one kind or another. As I walk down the street, I can easily imagine what life on Maple Street was like 100 years ago. Ray Bradbury captured it, though he didn't know it, in his wonderful summertime book I recommend to you called Dandelion Wine. Dandelion Wine. It's a short book. It's worth reading during the summer. Bradbury writes, "About 7 o'clock, you could hear the chairs scraping back from the tables, someone experimenting with a yellow-toothed piano, if you stood outside the dining room window and listened. Matches being struck, the first dishes bubbling in the suds and tinkling on the wall racks, somewhere, faintly, a phonograph playing. And then, as the evening changed the hour, as at house after house on the twilight streets, under the immense oaks and elms, on shady porches, people would begin to appear, like those figures who tell good or bad weather in rain or shine clocks. Uncle Bert, perhaps, grandfather, then father, and some of the cousins, the men all coming out first into the syrupy evening, leaving the women's voices behind in the cooling, warm kitchen to set their universe aright. Then the first male voices under the porch brim, the feet up, the boys fringed on the worn steps or wooden rails, where sometimes during the evening something, a boy or a geranium pot, would fall off. At last, like ghosts hovering momentarily behind the screen door, grandma, great-grandma, and mother would appear, and the men would shift, move, and offer seats. The women carried varieties of fans with them, folded newspapers, bamboo whisks, or perfumed kerchiefs to start the air moving about their face as they talked. What they talked of all evening long, no one remembered the next day. It wasn't important to anyone what the adults talked about. It was only important that the sounds came and went over the delicate ferns that bordered the porch on three sides. It was only important that the darkness filled the town like black water being poured over the houses, and that the conversations went on and on. The rocking chairs sounded like crickets. The crickets sounded like rocking chairs. And the moss-covered rain barrel by the dining room window produced another generation of mosquitoes to provide a topic of conversation through endless summers ahead. Sitting on the summer night porch was so good, so easy, and so reassuring that it could never be done away with. These were rituals that were right and lasting. In 2019, as you walk along Maple Street, you'll see really cute front porches with swings on them, front porches with wicker chairs, front porches with Adirondacks chairs, front porches with benches, front porches with chairs in different sizes, one that's just right for each member of the family with young children. But what you won't see on Maple Street are people sitting in those chairs or benches or swings. We're all too busy, too untrusting that God is the Lord of time, too fearful or behind to declare even a short Sabbath break and put relationship with God, with others, or even with our own thoughts before the work in front of us. We're so often Marthas, unhappy that the Mary in us might even consider hanging out on the front porch of our lives to just talk about nothing important with those we love or live near. Well, friends, at least for me this summer, it's taught me that it's time to rehabilitate Martha and Alice's white rabbit. I'm declaring a Sabbath break. Through the rest of the summer and into the fall, you'll find me spending a lot of evening time sitting on my front porch or my back patio. If you're in the Dobbs Ferry area in the evening during the next 2 months, drive down Maple Street and slow down when you pass the porch with the white wicker rockers on it. Odds are good that, if I can just let the white rabbit in me go for a little while, I'll be out on one of those chairs, remembering the biblical ritual that is so right and so lasting, the ritual of Sabbath time. May it be so for me. May it be so for all of us this summer. Amen.